story begins in March of 1942. Really, the story begins in December of 1941 when the Japanese, on a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, sink most of the American Pacific Fleet, with the exception of the aircraft carriers, which are by luck out of the harbor on that day. By destroying the Pacific Fleet, essentially the Japanese knock the Americans out of the war in the Pacific for at least 6 months as the Americans start to rebuild capacity to see if they can't begin to prevent the Japanese advance. Meanwhile, in 1941, Hitler has already overrun all of Western Europe, and by the end of 41, he's on the gates of Moscow. So things are going badly. London's been bombed for a year, and most of England is waiting frighteningly for a cross-channel invasion that never comes, but they're worried about it. There's a lunch at the White House, and this man, Hap Arnold, General Hap Arnold, is the head of the U.S. Army Air Force. At the time, the Air Force in America was part of the Army, and this man is having lunch with this man, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whom he hates. He thinks Roosevelt's sort of a playboy loser. By the way, he's a cripple too. He comes from a military family. You can sort of see it in Hap Arnold's demeanor here. And he thinks very little of President Roosevelt. In fact, Roosevelt knows that Hap Arnold thinks very little of him, and Hap Arnold has been disloyal to the president numerous times, but Roosevelt needs all the generals he can get, and he's not in the business of pushing people out simply because they don't like him. He needs generals. And Pearl Harbor is December of 41, and they're having lunch in March of 42, so things are going badly for the Allies. So, Hap Arnold turns to President Roosevelt at this lunch at the White House and says, "Mr. President, do you have a plan to win this war?" Roosevelt says, "Yes, General, I do have a plan." And Hap Arnold undoubtedly says something sarcastic like, "Would you mind sharing your plan with me, Mr. Playboy Loser, cripple?" And Roosevelt says, "No, General, I have no problem at all sharing the plan with you." He takes a napkin off the table, and in his own hand he writes, "Here's how I'm going to win it, General. I'm going to hold Australia, India west of Calcutta, Persia, Caucasus, Syria, and Iraq, and Egypt. I'm going to attack Japan proper, and I'm going to attack France. That's how I think we can win this war." And he says, "Well, Mr. President, I disagree if you think we're going to attack Japan. It's a fanatical nation. It will never succumb to an attack. It will be totally devastating for us. I think it's just a terrible idea to attack Japan." And Roosevelt says, "No, General, I'm thinking of 2 air attacks. One from the land, one from the sea. I'm not thinking of an invasion." And Hap Arnold goes, "Well, maybe that'll work." The lunch ends, and Hap Arnold turns to the president and says, "Mr. President, can I have the napkin?" And Roosevelt thinks, well, he's my general, head of my Air Force. I told him the plan. It's not a big secret to him. Okay. He says, "Sure, General, you can have the napkin." So Arnold takes the napkin in Roosevelt's hand, and he goes back to the Pentagon 3 miles away where the U.S. Army is headquartered, and he writes a memo to the file. And the memo basically says, "Memorandum for the record. President's recommendation on winning the war. The attach was given to me March 15th by President Roosevelt as his ideas, not mine, put down in a very simple way, as to how the war could be won." He's dripping with confidence. "I told him that I disagreed with his attack 1 if it meant a major offensive. He assured me, after all, I'm in charge here, that the attack 1 meant 2 air offensives against Japan proper, 1 from the sea, 1 from China." He stamps it secret, files it, and staples Roosevelt's napkin to the memo in the Pentagon and puts it in his files. And in 1967, the Department of Defense of the United States decides this is no longer a big secret. World War II is pretty much assured, in the bag. And they release the memo and the napkin, and they give it back to Hap Arnold's family, because in those days you got to keep your papers, who ultimately sells it to me. So now look at what you have here. First of all, you have in March of 1942, when the Allied forces were basically being crippled and killed everywhere, you have on a napkin a man's plan to win the war, which is exactly what he does, with the exception of he attacks France, D-Day, before he attacks Japan proper, because he's made a commitment to Stalin despite Churchill's efforts to try to hold it back. He's made a commitment to Stalin to open a second front because, of course, there is no Western front to speak of in the war anymore. It's all out in the East. And without a second front in D-Day, the Nazis were fighting a one-front war. So he made a commitment to Stalin. Eventually, he tried North Africa. That didn't work so well. So eventually, of course, that's D-Day. So he flipped it. But short of that, here you see how to win World War II on a napkin. So anytime somebody comes in with a complicated plan, say, look, boss, I got this plan, how we can do this new business, this new idea, you just need to say, wow, there's a lot of material here. Is this harder than winning World War II? And people will usually say, unless it's curing cancer, no, this is not harder than winning. Well, I saw how to do that on a napkin. Why don't you come back when you can tell me your plan on a napkin? And here you've seen the world's greatest cover your ass memo. Right? A general saying, I told him that I disagreed with his attack and it meant this, that. Right? He didn't even have to write this, but no, he couldn't help himself. He writes a memo, so when this whole thing collapses, he can say, I told him that was a bad idea. I have the memo on a napkin, staked in my files, completely covering his ass. There you go. How to win World War II on a napkin.